Do South African politicians care about the climate? With it almost being time to vote, we spoke to some major political parties about what they plan to do about climate change if they do well in the elections. Here's what they have to say.
I think the conversations are definitely taking place, and I do think that the climate change bill is a step in the right direction. I think it really comes down to implementation. For instance, at that 8.5 billion commitment that was made by those EU partners a few years back, how long that's taken, nothing's really been spent yet. We don't believe that the ANC will be able to deliver the jobs that are needed in the short to medium term, which will then prolong the transition away from fossil fuels towards more renewable energy. The DA has created 78.9% of all jobs in the country in the Western Cape. That is really the problem with this current government, is that you have the best of intentions, but they get chucked into this ANC machine and it just goes incredibly slowly. And part of the reason is that there are disagreements within the current ANC cabinet about the best way forward. We're facing an energy crisis at the moment. And as soon as these elections are finished, load shedding's coming back. I'll tell you right now, without getting too political on the discussion, people say every election cycle, this is the most important election ever. This really is the most important election ever. I think people just need to think very carefully.
So, Dave, just to get things going, I mean, there are so many challenges facing South Africa at the moment, and I can see across the political spectrum in terms of the work that's being done, there's very little discussion of climate change. Obviously, the focus is on jobs, poverty, corruption, etc. But would you mind just outlining how serious an issue climate change is for the DA?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, climate change is a massive issue, and it's something that the DA has been prioritizing for a long time. We are one of the few political parties who's made that a key aspect where we are in government already, in the city of Cape Town, for instance, and in the DA-led Western Cape. We have been at the forefront of putting in place strategies to deal with the impacts of climate change. City of Cape Town put a groundbreaking climate change strategy in place back in 2017, and the Western Cape government's been working on climate change related policies since as early as 2009. So there is a lot of work that's already being done. We've also played quite a significant role in the development of the climate change bill by the Portfolio Committee on Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment, and something that I've been directly involved in as well, attending those public hearings across the country, and making some recommendations and some amendments which were accepted by the Minister. And at the end of the day, our governments and our public representatives in the NCOP as well were in support unanimously of that bill going through for approval, and hopefully it does end up getting signed off by the President before the end of this term of office.
You make quite a lot of reference to what's been done in the Western Cape. Is the idea to essentially roll out that model across the country, assuming you do well in the elections?
So one of the things that we have seen come through very strongly within the climate change bill is reference to localized strategies being drawn up and implemented within municipalities and provinces. And it's something that we very much support within the DA. As you know, we've been pushing for a long time for devolution of more powers to localized governments. And we feel that people on the ground and public representatives on the ground are more in touch with what's happening, as opposed to having a kind of centralized approach and a one-size-fits-all approach to running these things out. And so we're very supportive of that. And like I say, we've already started to do that within the areas that we're in government. And should we be able to govern another province or two and potentially form the center of a national government after the 29th of May, we would make sure that that particular provision is well enforced, and that these localized strategies are put in place across the country.
I, when I do research for this, I found a position paper that was published in 2022. And one of the elements that comes out quite strongly is the notion of how politicized the just transition conversation has become. How would you summarize the DA's position on what a just transition really is?
So at the center of the just transition is the question of jobs in the economy. That's really what it comes down to. Yes, there are other aspects as well. We have communities living close to uh, fossil fuel industries, particularly in the Mpumalanga area, where we have very large coal mining operations taking place. And there's jobs and employment centered around that. But effectively, from the DA's perspective, we believe that we can't be putting anybody at added risk in what is a very delicate social climate when it comes to jobs by transitioning too quickly and putting more people closer to poverty. We have a terrible unemployment rate at the moment of close to 40%. So we have to be very sensitive when it comes to that. We don't believe that the ANC will be able to deliver the jobs that are needed in the short to medium term within some of these areas in Mpumalanga, for instance, and other parts of the country, which will then prolong the transition away from fossil fuels towards more renewable energy. That said, there is a stat at the moment, which is a real stat, even though it might sound quite outrageous, which is that the DA has created 78.9% of all jobs in the country in the Western Cape over the past 5 years. And those jobs have been sent in the Western Cape. There has been some quibbling around the interpretation of that stat, but that stat is a real stat. And what it does show, I think, without a shadow of a doubt, is that we are better at creating jobs. So, we don't want to see a situation where there is an expectation that everybody who's working within the coal mining sector is going to find a job within the renewable sector, because that's not realistic. What we have to do is make sure that we create the environment for more jobs across the board in areas like Mpumalanga. And there are lots of other places that we can create jobs within tourism, within other industries in the Western Cape. For instance, we are rolling out a lot of jobs when it comes to business process outsourcing. And the BPO sector is really a growing sector within South Africa. And there's a lot of investor confidence in the Western Cape at the moment. So it really does come down to creating enough jobs for people so that the impact of that transition isn't felt as strongly. I mean, I think there are around about 100,000 workers employed directly at the moment within the coal mining sector. And I think that comprises about 0.5% of all jobs in South Africa at the moment. So it sounds like a lot, but we intend in the Western Cape to create 800,000 jobs within the next 5 years. So it is possible to fill that gap.
But when I look at the DA manifesto, there's not as much reference to climate change, and I think we would have expected it working in that space. There's a lot of talk about energy. Could you maybe expand a little bit on how you see the link between the climate change arguments and job creation and poverty alleviation, to sort of expand on what's in the manifesto?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the manifesto, and I have heard this criticism already, and I understand where it comes from. There isn't a lot of reference in our manifesto to climate change. But I think it's important, as you mentioned in the outset, for us to remember what the kind of key core pressing issues are politically at the moment for most people. And we've tended to focus more on those within that manifesto. There is reference to our commitment to net zero. But, aside from that, we're in the process at the moment of actually developing a brand new environmental strategy. We've already had a series of webinars with professionals from academia and members across the country. And the first aspect that is being addressed is climate change. And then we're moving on to all the other ones, water conservation, etc. We do have a policy, which is the natural resources policy, which is available online, and it does make reference to it, but it's a little bit out of date. And I think a lot has happened between that policy being published and where we are currently with all of the new IPCC reports and all of that's come out. So it's something that we're currently working on expanding. Our energy policy, that said, is actually quite recent. I think it was 2022. It came out, and that's available online as well. And that does also make reference to a lot of what we would like to see in terms of diversifying the energy mix and increasing access for the private sector to enter in when it comes to power generation. I mean, we feel very strongly that Eskom should be unbundled in order to help create those opportunities, and also for us to remove the bottlenecks that currently exist within Eskom that prevent independent power producers from getting involved. It's all fine and well for us to say that we want to transition away from fossil fuels, but we have to ensure that we have alternatives in place before we can do that. Around about 70% more potentially of our energy is currently coming from coal, which means that we've still got a long way to go before we can get that transition moving at the pace we'd like to see.
I'm just curious about the policy development process. I mean, you talk about the fact that there are 100,000 workers who could possibly be affected by policy change, by downscaling fossil fuels, etc. And obviously there are their families, there are entire communities that are dependent on the fact that those coal-fired power stations exist. Are you able, or are you interested in involving those communities in some way? Or is it essentially talking to people who are experts and analysts who've been working in the field? So how do you actually develop those new policy approaches?
Sure. I mean, I think it's definitely has to be a combination of the two. The climate change bill, for instance, it's quite broad in terms of what it intends to achieve. And the real impact is going to come when those regulations are put in place. And I think that is really where we need to see involvement from all political parties, in particular from our own, in the coming term of office, when those regulations are drawn up, because that's really where the rubber is going to hit the road, so to speak. And a huge part of that has to be involving local communities and understanding the various local economies that exist within those areas. We have for instance, huge informal economic activity that also takes place in and around many of these mining towns, and people rely massively on the informal economy. Informal economy makes up about a third of our entire economy in South Africa. So we have to make sure that we take that into consideration as well. But yeah, that's really what it's going to come down to. We've been around the country during the development of the climate change bill and visited all 9 provinces and very rural communities within many of these areas. And, I think there is a desire to be involved in the decision-making process. There may not be the same depth of understanding when it comes to climate change within some of these areas. And for obvious reasons, people are more concerned at the moment with ensuring that they have food to eat at the end of the month, with the rising cost of living. But it's up to us to make sure that we take that enthusiasm of the people in those areas to get involved and work with them to help develop policies, like we said earlier, that speak to local issues and aren't broad brush, one-size-fits-all approaches.
The sense that we get around the policy discussions is that, and I mean, it might be symptomatic of the governing party, but the global conversations around climate change are happening incredibly quickly, and they seem to be happening incredibly slowly here. I mean, would you agree with that assessment?
I mean, I think the conversations are definitely taking place, and I do think that the climate change bill is a step in the right direction. I think it really comes down to implementation. And if one looks at, for instance, at that 8.5 billion commitment that was made by those EU partners a few years back, how long that's taken, and nothing's really been spent yet. It's a real kind of arduous process, and I think that is really the problem with this current government, is that you have the best of intentions, but they get chucked into this ANC machine, and it just goes incredibly slowly. And part of the reason is that there are disagreements within the current ANC cabinet about the best way forward. Where there are certain people within the cabinet who believe that we shouldn't be taking any money from the West, and that it's all a big CIA plot. And others are a lot more open to the idea. But if you can't get a kind of coherent position within your own cabinet, it's a very dangerous position to be in, because it just means that every decision is going to be prolonged by this drawn out process of quibbling and negotiations. So I think we need more action when it comes to implementation, but I do think the discussions are taking place. And I do think that, there is broad agreement within the South African public, especially after the floods in the KZN province a couple of years back, that climate change isn't something that's coming down the road. It's something that is happening right now. And, we need to do what we can, particularly when it comes to adaptation, to ensure that we are prepared for what's coming.
Do you think that, what sort of signal do you think that policy uncertainty or policy contradiction at times, what sort of signal do you think that sends to the entities that do have money available?
It sends a very negative signal. And, what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance, I was part of a presentation a few days ago where one of the presenters, an expert on climate finance, was showing how low the private contribution versus the public contribution towards climate change is in sub-Saharan Africa. And she said openly, the challenge is investor confidence. People feel apprehensive about investing in Africa because they are concerned about corruption. Now, we should be, as sort of the most developed economy, really within Africa, really pushing as hard as possible to show that, if you give us the money, we'll spend it in the right places. Unfortunately, the government, and this isn't even a political, it's just the reality. Our current government has shown that it's not capable of doing that over many years. And I think that is going to be the key challenge going forward, is ensuring that we have a government in place that proves that they are hard on corruption. If we look at, the results of the outcomes of the findings of the Zondo report, how many politicians have actually been taken to task? Zero. We had Jacob Zuma go to jail for a couple of months and then be released after going through, the full court process. And it's actually mind-boggling. So if I was an overseas investor and I was looking at that scenario, I would also be apprehensive at present. And that's not a good space to be in.
And so you're a shadow minister. Let's assume that the DA does well on May 29 and you are the minister. What would the first 2 or 3 things you would do, particularly to get access to that funding and get that financing into the country? Because corruption is a 10-year project, right? I mean, we've seen that. It's a huge amount of time. Are there any sort of immediate steps do you think could be taken to begin to access that funding and get it into the country? Because the sense we get is that there's growing impatience, and that ship may sail. We might lose out on that completely. Do you think there's anything that can be done quickly, almost immediately, to change that?
Well, I think, without sounding too blunt, I think the best way to do that would be to get a new government in place. Because we can see that there's an intransigence when it comes to the ANC, and it's going to be a long time before real action is taken when it comes to corruption and people are shifted out of these positions. There are political decisions that can be taken by the current government to move against members, and they're refusing to do so. That's not something that we see within our own party. So, if we were at the center of a new government after the 29th of May, one of the first things we would do is take action against all of those involved in corruption. There is more than enough evidence at present for us to really start with those processes. But there's a real dragging of feet when it comes to the ANC. I think the second thing would be restoring that confidence with our global partners, particularly our Western donors. And the reality is the vast majority of climate funding is coming from partners in the West. And it doesn't help when you have the ANC cozying up to their friends in Russia, who are their biggest donors at present, who are more interested in rolling out Russian nuclear projects within South Africa and getting access to our uranium deposits, for instance, and lauding countries like Iran as being progressive. That's certainly not something that's going to build confidence either. So we need to make sure that we restore the confidence of our Western partners as well, and that's certainly something for my colleagues within foreign relations to take up. But we are really getting positive responses from the international community when it comes to our election campaign at the moment. They like the way that we are moving when it comes to our commitments to fighting corruption and forming the center of a new coalition government. So it's largely positive at present. We just have to do all we can between now and the 29th of May.
There's obviously no such thing as free money, but I mean, in terms of accessing the financing that's available, do you think there are any compromises that might need to be made? Let's assume that the DA is part of a governing coalition. Do you think there are compromises to be made? And if so, where do you think South Africa should be flexible? Because, I mean, there are very strong arguments that this is about reparations, essentially. It's time to pay reparations for the damage that's been done to our economy and our environment. So let's put policy to one side, corruption to the other side, and talk money. I mean, do you think that we should look at making compromises to enable that money to come into the country quite efficiently? And if so, how do you then manage the reparation argument, given that there's so many priorities in terms of a just transition? To what extent do you think that should be at the front of the conversation? I don't know if you don't have to use my language of reparations. I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. No, that's fine. 100%. So look, I mean, I've been to 4 COPs now. And the first one I went to was in 2012. I think it was Rio Plus 20. I think it was 2012. Anyway, and at every one of the COPs that I've been at, this discussion comes up, particularly within what you term the global south, the developing world, that we weren't responsible for climate change. The global north has had over 100 years of industrialization, where they have polluted the atmosphere and they've created the situation that we're in now, and we now have to pay our own costs to fix this. And it's our communities within the developing world that are going to suffer the most, etc. And look, it's a valid argument. It's a valid argument. The challenge is, I don't think there's anything currently in place in any sort of international law that compels any of those developed countries to make reparations. So I think it really is a case. I mean, if one looks at the Loss and Damage Fund as an example, and the discussions around that, it's a case of well-intentioned countries who are wanting to assist, and any of those well-intentioned countries who make offers, we have to take those with both hands and make sure that we make concessions where need be. But we also have to remember that we're a sovereign country, and we can't be forced into certain positions purely based on financial incentives. I think there is a big discussion, for instance, around the carbon border adjustment mechanism from the EU, and whether that is as altruistic as it might be put forward as. There are some countries who are a bit cynical and see it more as a trade trade tool than a way to combat climate change, partly because it's going to be incredibly difficult for countries, especially a country like ours, to comply with what's being asked for in a relatively short term. As I say, we are a country that's still largely dependent on coal, and we have industries that may end up being severely impacted in terms of manufacturing. I think it's a considerable amount of money every year that we would lose if those regulations were implemented against South Africa. Although I fear that are coming on the line regardless of what we'd like to see. But that was also part of key negotiations during the COP, and I myself sat in some bilaterals where that was discussed, not only from our side, but I know from other developing countries as well. I think the other thing we have to mention is the elephant in the room, which is China. And the G7 made a commitment the other day to reduce carbon emissions net zero by 2050, I think it was. But one of the most powerful economies in the world wasn't part of that conversation. And that economy also is the one that's contributing 30% of global emissions at present. So, there are some progressive things taking place in China when it comes to the rolling out of renewable resources. Definitely, they've got a fleet of electric buses and they've got all sorts of things. Yeah, it looks really impressive. But if you're still producing 30% of global emissions and still building new coal-fired power stations, it's in my opinion, meaningless. You have to show a commitment to a transition, and that's what it all comes down to. Even in South Africa, we contribute, quite a small percentage of global emissions. We're 14th at the moment, but we still play a role, and we still have to recognize that, we need to transition away from fossil fuels towards more renewable resources. And it makes sense as well. Solar is now the cheapest form of energy that you can get. So we have to make sure we get our grids in place. We have to make sure that we roll out these incentives and we get as much solar onto roofs in particular as we can in a short space of time.
Just a last question. What's the DA's position on nuclear? I mean, is it a factor? Is it just too expensive and too long-term to think about, or is it an option, do you think?
So the DA is not necessarily opposed to nuclear. Our energy policy speaks to this, and we've got a sort of a watching brief on potential nuclear projects. But as you've mentioned, the challenge is the build time. So it's often over 12 years, 13 years from start to finish to get a nuclear plant up and running. We're facing an energy crisis at the moment, and as soon as these elections are finished, load shedding's coming back. I'll tell you right now. So we have to try and find ways that we can roll out electricity in the short term. And one of those ways is by augmenting our current electricity mix. We are trying in the city of Cape Town, for instance, to create what we call prosumers, which is a consumer of electricity that is able to feed excess electricity that generates from their own solar panels back into the grid, and that's already being rolled out. That's a way that we can improve types of nuclear infrastructure that are being rolled in other parts of Africa. These small modular reactors, for instance, that can be transported into rural areas to generate electricity. So we're keeping a watching brief on it, because nuclear is a very clean form of energy. I mean, it's probably the cleanest form of energy. The challenge is that if something goes wrong, there are catastrophic consequences. So that, combined with the build time, obviously makes people apprehensive. But I think our priority at the moment must be diversifying in terms of renewables. First and foremost, solar. In the Northern Cape, for instance, we have some of the highest solar potential in the world. And we also have a lot of really good wind, particularly in places like the Eastern Cape. So that combined with things like green hydrogen, green steel, that can also really help us to increase our footprint when it comes to those other green industries as well.
Dave, thank you. It's been very helpful. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add, but I'm pretty much covered in terms of what I wanted to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, without getting too political on the discussion, we really are facing a watershed moment this month. And, people say every election cycle, this is the most important election ever. This really is the most important election ever. We are moving into a new phase where we will see some form of a coalition government for the first time, aside from obviously the government of national unity. But this is going to be the first time we have a proper coalition government in place. And I think people just need to think very carefully about what they want that coalition government to look like, because it could really go one of two ways. And I think the alternative is too horrific to think of. But anyway, thanks very much, Chris. I really appreciate the discussion.